What I'm going to talk about today is what I have sort of not so creatively titled the Great Book Project of 2013, which was my New Year's resolution last year, where I read 5 books a week for 9 months. And the reason why I did this was pretty much summarized there, which is like most people, I assume. I had a giant pile of books that I never made any progress on whatsoever. They sat there, I never read them, and I really wanted to make distinguishable progress on them and really dig into my reading habits. So I set this pretty hard goal of 5 books a week. I read pretty fast, so it's not as crazy as it may seem, but it was something that was pretty challenging for me. And I used a whole set of tools, including Goodreads, which kept track of all the books I was reading, the public library, because I didn't actually want to buy all the books I was reading, and Excel for some metadata. And I learned a lot about my reading habits and what I think is important to take into account when you're reading in the course of this project. I also sort of did a self-tracking mechanism, which was a little different in that I actually blogged a book review for every single book I read over the course of this project. And they were in 5 book chunks. And over the course of this project, you saw them go from pretty short and I liked this book, you should read it, to very involved. I don't think you should actually try and read this, but there's a book review for every book I read during that period last year. But one of the things I noticed over the course of the project is that as I progressed, I was reading stuff that I found interesting and that people were recommending to me, but it wasn't from a pretty diverse set of authors. I looked at my January data, and I had read books that were mostly by men and mostly by white people. And I don't know if that's something other people think about, but I'm really interested in sort of a diverse set of voices in the narratives I consume and the media I consume. So I felt like this was actually a problem. I was also convinced before I looked at this data that I was reading equally between men and women, and the data actually showed me that wasn't true at all. I'm sure that's not shocking. So I set up a set of goals, which was 50% female authors and 30% authors that were people of color, and that's the fine print, because I discovered it was actually a little harder than I thought to quantify that. And for the rest of the project, I really strove to hit those goals. One of the things I learned was that the recommendations I got from other people were really influenced by sort of who they were and the books that they read, which were pretty close to the books that I read. Sort of homophily, which is this idea from Ethan Zuckerman's Rewire book, is that people recommend books that they think you're going to like, and that people recommend books that are really, really similar to the stuff you've already read, which means that you're going to read things that sort of stay within your bubble. So one of the challenges was finding new ways to reach outside my bubble and do media consumption that really shows who we value and listen to in a new way, rather than focusing on sort of New York Times editorial writers, which, not shockingly, also tend to be white and male. So this was actually really difficult for me. I was not thinking that it was going to be a problem to find books by people of color, but it turns out that if you're looking for them, this is actually a worthwhile way to do it. That people underutilize traditional information gathering tools when they're sort of thinking about books, but that's actually the best way to do it. So one of the things I discovered is it got a lot easier. I got a lot better at reading books by women and books by people of color. So by the time I hit August, I was doing much better. But at the beginning, I wasn't sure where to turn, because the people who I would turn to for recommendations would suggest books that were pretty close to what I was already reading. I came really, really close to my goals. By September, I had hit 49% women and 28% people of color. And I'm a little ashamed I didn't hit them, because I'm kind of a perfectionist. But at the same time, I could have extended it for a week and actually hit the goals, but then I decided it wasn't worth it and I should just give up. And in fact, because the next week after I finished this project, I started law school. So I figured 5 books a week and law school was not something I really wanted to try. And so I gave up there. But what I learned in the process was really that I had sort of confined myself to a bubble in terms of how I chose the books that I read, and that really contributed to sort of this problem where I had a whole bunch of piles of books that I wanted to read, and some of them applied cryptography. I was not going to get through 5 of that book in a week. But some of these I just didn't actually want to read, so that was actually a really useful lesson for me. So the takeaways here, I'm not going to surprise anyone in this room by saying that tracking things actually really improves your knowledge of what's going on as opposed to estimating. That's pretty much preaching to the choir here. But I also learned that it was really easy for me to fall into media consumption patterns, and that breaking out of them is really hard. So that's my very short 5-minute talk on the book reading project. And since I like talking about books, I'm putting up some book recommendations. And I'm happy to talk about any part of this, including the other data I gathered while I was doing this project during questions.
Thank you. Please, question.
Yeah.
Did you find that any books or any type of book improved your mood or correlated with any other things that you were talking?
This actually happened after the book reading project, but I'll tell the anecdote anyway because I think it's funny. I was reading The Circle for a book club, and I found that every time I picked it up, I became profoundly unhappy and wanted to throw my Kindle out a window. And so that really made me notice that the books had changed my mood. But I think what happened, I noticed a lot. Actually, in May, got about 15 books behind. Which was a pretty substantial thing to catch up. But fortunately, I quit my job in July, so I spent all my time reading then. But what would happen is I'd get into a book I didn't like, and then I'd get halfway through it or a third of the way through it, and I really just did not want to pick it up and finish it. But at the same time, I knew I needed to pick it up and finish it because I'd already gotten a third of the way through. So I would just stop reading rather than continuing on that book. So what it really, I think part of what that taught me, and part of what the pile of shame joke is kind of about, is that if you haven't read a book for a while, you probably just don't want to read it. And maybe unless there's some really, really good reason that you should be reading it, you might just want to let it go. Because if it's what's standing in between you and something you really enjoy, like reading, because you have this sense of guilt about the book you didn't finish. I have lots of senses of guilt about the books I didn't finish. That's not worth it. So for me, that was actually a really good lesson that came out of this project, was that I should just put the book down and walk away rather than trying to continue it, even if that's what I kind of feel like I should do. Yeah.
Were you a 5 minutes on the tee, 5 minutes at lunch? How did you fit it in? What was your approach?
I actually tend to just read books in long chunks, so it was 4 hours on the couch was my optimal method. Although I would always have a book with me, usually 3, and usually a paper copy book and a Kindle as well in case I got bored of the paper book. I don't know. So it was definitely 3 or 4 hours a couple times a week, and then on the weekends sometimes I would read for longer. But I do read really fast, which did really help with this project. Yeah, Miguel, sorry, I can't read your name tag.
Do you find reading that many books gives you a good retention rate over the information you gather in this?
It depends. I'm really bad with protagonists' first names. I can read a book and I can tell you the plot. I won't be able to remember the first name of the protagonist, which kind of makes you sound like an idiot if you're trying to talk about the book. You're that guy, what's his name? But so the retention really varied. I think the books I got the most into, I definitely feel I retained the best. There were some books that I kind of sat down and I read and I forgot about because I didn't really like them very much. I think the reviewing actually really helped my retention because I would have to come back a week or two later and actually be what did I think about that book? What was it about? Did I like it? And I also rated all these books on Goodreads. So there's some there's some books where I was it's a 1 and I'd prefer to forget that I ever spent time on it. And then there's books where it's a 5 and I loved it a lot. So, Vincent.
Can you talk a little bit about what this list of recommendations would look like before this project?
Yeah.
And what it looks like now and what the main differences are?
Sure, and yeah, that's a great question. So I think what's really interesting about these recommendations, and something you may have picked up on in asking the question, is that most of the fiction recommendations are actually by people of color. And I think that wouldn't have been the case without the diversity goals because it really encouraged me to stretch outside the confines of the work I usually read. So just for reference, the books I'm really usually into tend to be sort of sci-fi or pop science or tech books, which tend, unfortunately, this is a refrain in the presentation, to be written by white dudes. So I think it would have looked really different. I did find that some of the nonfiction I read at the beginning, which I'd been sort of saving up for a while, something like Thinking Fast and Slow, which everyone had recommended to me, and I finally read during the project. It was still amazing. And some, the David Foster Wallace probably falls into that category. But especially in fiction, I found myself discovering sort of books and authors that I had never really thought about reading, or I don't think I would have discovered otherwise. Yeah.
What was your underlying motivation for wanting to read 5 books a week? And did you achieve it?
I wanted to rediscover sort of a love of reading. I always used to read books when I was a child, and I would just sit and read for hours, and that was I would avoid going to sleep because I wanted to read. I would hide from my parents and turn the light off and then turn the light back on. I see someone nodding, so at least there's one other person in the room who did this, right? And that's sort of hard to do when you're in school, and I think it's hard to do when your life is really consumed, and other media choices can be really easier than books in some way. So yeah, I think I actually did achieve it. I mean, it was a pretty punishing pace, and my friends at the time were like, oh my God, Kendra. I'm like, no, can't hang out, gotta read a book. It was really enjoyable, and I think it allowed me to talk about books in a way that I didn't before. I would, start conversations with people like, what are you reading? And they'd be like, why are you asking me that? And I'm like, no, I need to know what books you're reading because I'm gonna read them next. Will you loan me something? That's all I talked about for 9 months. So I do think I did actually achieve it, which was kind of nice. Yes?
If you do this experiment again in the future, what other things would you change in terms of tools or methodologies or number of books or time period and so on?
Yeah, I would probably count pages instead of books. Because one of the things this did, which may be pretty obvious, but it was incentivize reading short books, which was valuable because I think that's not something I would necessarily otherwise pay a lot of attention to is book length. And it was definitely something that I was like, all right, it's 900 pages. Well, that's not going to happen. So I think if I were to do it again, I would do pages because it also meant that I couldn't really spend time reading things that weren't books, like something like an article or I would be like, nah, can't read this, gotta go read a book. It was like a refrain for 9 months, gotta go read a book. So I would probably count pages instead, I think, because I think that would create more interesting outcomes. I also didn't track a lot of stuff on this project that I kind of wish I did. I wish I had tracked whether I had read the book on the Kindle or a paper copy, because I think that would have been really interesting. And because I have aggregate ratings, I could see if I like Kindle books better, which would totally not actually be clean data because there's a whole set of reasons why I had them on a Kindle versus I had a paper copy. But in any case, I think that would have been interesting. And I didn't track page numbers for books or, there's all kinds of other stuff that I think I would do but won't go do now because I have a list of 175 books and I'm not gonna go add all that information for. Yeah?
Did you go back and change any of your ratings?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Yes. So what happened a couple times was I read a series, and I felt like the ratings weren't, my thoughts about the series weren't consistent, right? I would love the first book and then the second, third book would be okay, but I would rate them really highly because I had just read the first book and I loved it so much, and I would go back and be like, that's not so honest. I also think my ratings skewed differently over the course. I kind of felt guilty about giving people 2s on Goodreads, even if I didn't like their books very much, which, is weird, but that's okay. So I think they did change a little bit, and the one time I explicitly remember going back and changing ratings was in reference to series and how I felt about the first book really coloring my experience of the second and third. Yeah?
How would you feel about incorporating audiobooks? Would that count for you, or would you feel like that was a replicable project?
So actually I did lay out a set of criteria at the beginning. Graphic novels counted, which was a redeeming thing because I could just be like, all right, I got 2 hours, I can read a graphic novel, I can knock out this day's book. But audiobooks didn't, because I think part of the goal was to get me to sit down and read and really spend time focused on books in a way that with an audiobook I would, I'd listen to it on the T or, it wouldn't be the same sort of feeling and experience. But actually, when I started this project, there was a Slate article on reading a book a day for a year, and this was kind of a response to that also, because I was like, I could do that, but a book a day seems a little bit weak. I'm gonna have to read crappy books, so I'm gonna, I should do 5. You seem to have your hand up. Did you read a book a day for a year?
No, but what gets me thinking is this whole idea of setting goals for the heck of it. I did one last year around running because I love running, but I was trying to understand habit forming, and I saw somebody in his Twitter bio that he'd been running for thousands of days or something like that, consecutively. So I said, habit forming is 3 weeks. Could I run 21 days? And I just set that goal, and the next thing I knew, I couldn't stop for 2 weeks. I went for a month and a half running every day, and now I think of running all the time. So, it's really cool, like the behavior modification that happens when you set yourself an arbitrary goal.
Yep.
Yeah, you were influenced by that, someone reading every day, but you were like, oh, should I do that? And so I'm just curious, like, who sets arbitrary goals? None of this, like, I measure stuff, but like, just an arbitrary goal, like, I'm going to walk by this building every day, or I'm going to, I'm going to take a stop earlier and just see what's out there every day, or take a different stop every day, or speak in the third person, or something like that. Yes, he does things like that. We do this at home. I mean, I do this with kids all the time. We get people to think of it, but like, do people here like set arbitrary goals, like read a book every day for a month?
I mean, I could raise my hand, but clearly you know the answer to that. What is the next one? That's a good question. Law school. Actually, that's a really good answer. Speaking of arbitrary goals. But yeah, actually, I do think I could have read a book a day, but one of the things I was concerned about is like how much that would incentivize reading really, really short books. And with 5 books a week, I actually got a little more latitude to read stuff a bit longer. Like if I was reading 7 books a week, I don't think I could have read Thinking Fast and Slow because like that took me a while and was sort of dense. So like books like that, if you're sort of like really going through them, it's really hard to. Yeah.
Did you find any difference in your motivation to continue reading versus, like obviously you said you weren't tracking Kindle versus Dead Tree Book?
That's a good question. I think it was more easy for me to see like the progress in Dead Trees, like sort of like the, there's sort of like this, I love the physicality of like actual books, and that's part of the reason why, some of the books I read on Kindle, but a lot I like, and if people would, and one of the actual things that was really interesting is the physical books I read tended to be, people would hand me books. I would say, if you hand me the book, I will read it, right? Like, this is like literally what my pitch to people, like, but I'll borrow the book and I will read it and I will give it back to you within like a week. And so I tended to have different feelings towards the 2 sets of books because of how I got them. Like the Kindle would be like, oh, okay, I'm like picking this up specifically because I know I want to read this book, or I got like a recommendation online. But like the physical copies were usually from people, so I like felt very differently towards them in that sense. But I don't think it actually had to do with the medium. Sarah.
Did you track the source of your recommendations?
Not explicitly, and again, like I wish I had. I think what was interesting was. Like some of the best recommendations I got really, really randomly, like the Juan Diaz books that like I loved all 3 of them. His books, I read all 3 of them. Was like somebody at a party where I was like, I'm looking for authors that are people of color, and they were like, have you tried this book? So it was like very like some of it was like very sort of like random, and some of it was very much like, oh, my best friend was like, I should read this book. I should definitely read it. So yeah.
So here's a little nostalgic question. Of any of the books that you read, whether they were from the Cambridge Library or Kindle, after you read them, did you want to go out and buy one and keep them?
Yes. So there are books. Yeah, I can't like, I'm not recalling any particular titles, but there were books that either people lent to me or I got from like the library where I rent out and bought a physical copy afterwards because I wanted to own it so much. I actually left my copy of Kindred in San Francisco and got back and recommended it to everyone I knew. And they were like, oh, can I borrow your copy? And I like had my friend's parents ship it to me from San Francisco because I was like, I feel so strongly about this book. I could have just bought a new one on Amazon, but that seemed strange, so I didn't do that.
Last question, please.
Yeah.
Did you make like lots of highlights and things and collect quotes as you were reading, or was it just?
No, if I'm reading something for fun, I don't write in the book. If I'm reading like books for school, then I'll like write in them and like write swear words in the corner where I think the judge screwed up, what that kind of thing. But when I'm like just like reading for fiction reading for pleasure, I don't write in books. So it's sort of interesting, and like I never really found myself getting into the Kindle highlighting thing. So.
Great, thank you so much.